From Los Angeles, the home of film and television, this is Film Music Live, a webcast featuring outstanding composers, orchestrators, filmmakers, and more from the world of music for film, television, and video games, talking about their work and answering your questions. Film Music Live is sponsored by the Film Music Network and Film Music Institute. And now the host of Film Music Live, Daniel Schweiger.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Schweiger, and welcome to Film Music Live, the show where you get to ask the questions to today's top composers. I'm happy to have you here. When one looks at how Austin, Texas has become a hub of winningly eccentric director and composer collaborations, then look no further than its alpha and omega of filmmaker Richard Linklater and his idiosyncratic muse, Graham Reynolds. Linklater made an immediate cult impression with the charming wastoids of Slacker and Dazed and Confused before broadening his stylistic and subject horizons with the likes of Before Sunrise, The Newton Boys, and School of Rock. But it was Linklater's fascination with surreal living animation that led him to his first collaboration with Graham Reynolds on the Philip K. Dick Future Cop adaptation of A Scanner Darkly in 2006. An improvisatory musician skilled in alternative music, opera, and modern classical, as well as a rustic Western sound, Reynolds went from strikingly eerie synths to playing a quirky polka sound for the real-life funeral-owning murderer Bernie before paying off Linklater's Meet Cute, Grow Old trilogy Before Midnight. He'd take on an emotional last detail with Last Flag Flying and follow Cate Blanchett to Antarctica in Where'd You Go, Bernadette, before returning home with Linklater for the HBO documentary series God Save Texas. But it's once again in True Crime where Linklater and Reynolds find Glenn Powell as a pointedly unlikely teacher who becomes a fake assassin to beat in corralling intended killers who don't want to get their hands dirty, until he falls for a beautiful Latina straight out of old-school Unhappy Wife film noir. For a tale that might not be as far out as you think, Reynolds jumps all over the hitman scoring map, from percolating suspense to seductive romance, jazz-funk vibes, and increasingly menacing tones as the hero's subterfuge goes out of control until there's seemingly no way out, all while capturing the film's locale of New Orleans. It's a score that plays both ironic fun and dead seriousness in a way that shows Graham Reynolds' ability to eclectically hit a scoring bullseye for Linklater's deft cross between the mainstream and indie eccentricity. And now, here to prove that composers actually do exist, here's one who scored a number of singularly inventive hits for Richard Linklater. Let's welcome Graham Reynolds to Film Music Live.
Hello, how are you?
It's great to have you here, Graham. Well, I guess let's just get started. How did you begin composing?
I like to come into the process as early as possible. And so I read a script. I talked to Rick about palette, and then I started making sketches. He had all sorts of ideas, and there's so many styles coming into the film with the noir stuff and the comedy stuff, and then of course the setting of New Orleans, that there was a lot to think about in terms of what's the palette going to be. So I just started throwing things at the wall and made 30, 40 sketches, brought some players in, created different motifs, and then we started getting the early cuts, and nothing was quite working. There were some ideas that maybe, but then, so I went down to Mexico City, brought this little sequencer sampler called Black Box by 1010 Music, and I chopped up a bunch of the tracks that I liked but weren't quite right, and I started doing these remixes and threw those in the folder, and Sandra, the editor, started pulling these sort of seemingly wacky at the time, but fitting to the film remixes into the rough cuts, and it started working. And so we used that as the jumping off point. So this like string quartet that was Schubert inspired became in 6/8 became this 4/4 with a slow drum beat for a certain scene late in the film. Other things that were big huge orchestral things became broken down into drum beats and electronics mixed with those instruments. It went through this whole process to turn into something new that fit what was coming out of the editing room.
Now, even going back even before that, how did you become a composer, and how, what was the Austin indie scene like that even led you to becoming a composer?
Yeah. So it's hard to know exactly where to start with that story, but I'll just start with moving to Texas. So a little over 30 years ago, I moved to Texas, moved to Austin. And I had piano, I had drums. I like to be really loud. So cities like New York or even LA, especially New York, because that's where I was closer to, like, it's really hard to be loud in an apartment. You've got neighbors on each wall. And Austin, you're able to super cheaply rent a house. And that allowed me to work in the same place where I lived. And then I started playing shows. And then I didn't go to film school or I didn't go to music school even. I didn't have an intention of scoring films. I always loved film scores, but I started playing out, and I was in punk rock clubs mostly, but playing instrumental, experimental music, but that had a cinematic leaning with melodies and sort of sweeping ideas and a lot of heavy contrast. And immediately people started asking me to score things. Now, it wasn't a big feature film or anything like that. It was more, hey, I've got an experimental puppet show, or I'm doing this theater thing, or I've got this contemporary dance or a little student short film. And I just started saying yes to everything. And the films became longer films, became silent films, and then became feature new films. And each little pocket of collaboration expanded and got to be, more professional, it was always exciting the whole time, but I got better at it. And I sort of learned how to score to picture and learned how to score, how to collaborate across mediums through all these different collaborations.
And how did you first come into contact with Richard?
So Rick is a presence around town. He's never been one to just sort of hole up and disappear. He's especially at Austin Film Society. But when I was working with theater companies or doing live music for experimental shorts, he would come to see stuff. And so I ended up doing this little 9/11 black and white short with him as sort of, I think, kind of an audition. And then we went from there to A Scanner Darkly. And that was a super deep dive because all that post-production time for the animation. And so we really got to dig in deep on that one.
Well, I mean, again, that was like a kind of whole style that he was using, I think, not only in that, but a couple of different films, and just had such a really utterly bizarre sound to it in the first. What was it like just discovering that sound for Scanner Darkly?
It took a long time, and it was scary at times. It felt like we weren't going to get there, and I was lucky to have the extra time from the animation. We talked a lot about palette, and I started making all these things, and saxophone was a really heavy focus when we were first doing it. And then pretty deep into the process, we realized saxophone really wasn't fitting. It wasn't matching what was on screen. So we stripped all that away, and it was holiday time. And so a lot of people were out of town. I needed to do a lot of work quickly for the next round of drafts. And so I got a Strat, and I'm not much of a guitarist, but I threw a whole bunch of guitar lines all across the score and started heavily processing the acoustic instruments that in a way that was a bit analogous to them shooting it in live action and then animating on top of the live action. And so the palette evolved dramatically in that iteration, and all of a sudden it felt like we were on the track, and we went from there.
Now, when you look at Hitman, I think probably the closest antecedent for that is Bernie, where Jack Black plays a true life funeral director who murders an old woman and sponges off her savings. I mean,
Yeah.
what was that kind of dive into true crime black comedy like for you?
Yeah, Bernie always, from the very beginning of reading the script, it's the same Skip Hollingsworth, the Texas Monthly writer, same journalist whose article each of the films are based on, and so there's a source point that overlaps. They're so different, the two, but comedy reacts to music much more differently than drama. It's a little more generous at times with what you can, how far you can push things. But at the same time, with the murder in Bernie, et cetera, that there's a serious note to these things. So finding that balance point between the two. Bernie, I think the palette came slightly more quickly because the Texas feel was there from the beginning. And I don't know, we got to a point where we felt pretty good right away. We also knew the hymns were going to be a big part of that score. And so we had a bit of a head start on that one in a way that we didn't with Hitman.
Wow. Now, when you got the assignment of Hitman, first of all, do you believe that Hitmen are real?
Do I now or did I then? I'd say, like, it always seemed like more like a myth or an iconic, like, it's sort of like stealthy ninjas that we grew up with in pop culture. They always seemed beyond what was possible humanly, and it seems so unlikely when you think about it that you can just go out, with a couple $100 or a couple $1,000 and just pay someone to kill someone. And that's the reason it seems preposterous, is because it doesn't really happen. It's not really a thing, but it's very good for making movies.
So did you research this guy, the true story of this guy who did not kill anybody, actually?
Yeah, that was the first thing I did, was read Skip's article and get familiar with with all of this. I didn't get to meet him the way I got. Well, after we made the movie, I got to meet the real life Bernie. But yeah, I love doing the research part and putting my head into the context and into the world that the film takes place in. That's a fun part of the process for me.
Wow. Now we've got our first question from Dale, and it's I apologize. Tell me about some of the keyboards in this. I mean, what did you use on Hitman? Are there any chance that you had some Optigan in there?
Okay. Now I'm going to try to remember what we used palette-wise. So the key piece of technology was that black box, that 1010 Music black box. There's no Optigan in there that I remember. And so programmed drums mixed with acoustic instruments and then manipulation of those sounds was the foundation of the palette. There are some Omnisphere patches. Who made them? Some really cool, sort of quirky, and they evolve, and it sounds almost like a tea kettle. So you get that sort of, it's going to boil over tension. I'm going to have to look that up and figure out who made those patches, because it was a sort of boutique patch maker that I was using for some of those quirky tension palettes.
Was it a Burning Piano?
I've used Burning Piano many times. It's funny, Omnisphere has its sort of like hit patches, and Burning Piano is one of the big hits. And we did a film about arson, a documentary years ago, and that was a natural one to use. And that it was a little on the nose, but it still fit really well. There's no Burning Piano on this one. There is some of the felt pianos that are so popular nowadays, and I worry that they get overused, but I love the sound too. So I'm riding with the zeitgeist there and embracing that felt piano sound. But burning piano is one of my favorites. I think one of everybody's favorites. There's a chromium. What's something chromium that has this great organic meets synthetic feel to it that I use a lot from Omnisphere. There are a handful of patches that are sort of I go back to. Harmonic Influences is a Prophet inspired synth that I go to a lot in there. I'm sort of built an EP I did recently was built around this one Harmonic Influences patch from Omnisphere. I don't think that particular patch is in Hitman, but I use it all the time.
Now, one thing I love about Hitman and the score is that it kind of brings in noir influences. Like you kind of have the noir staple of like the lonely wife who's unhappy and she gets the sap involved in her, and you don't quite know which way Madison is going to go, which brings us to a question from Oliver Cellini. Do you think your background in jazz helps score films more efficiently, especially when it comes to your kind of noir homage in Hitman?
Having the jazz training and jazz background plays a big role. It's hard to tell whether efficiency is what it does give me a palette. And for certain films like this, you get that minor major 7 chord that's like screams film noir. And so once you know some of these staple things that tells something to an audience about what style they're in or what period they're in, you can bounce off of that and then make it contemporary and fitting to the film you're in, but with a nod towards these palettes from the past and from different genres and eras.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, Hitman starts off in one way and it kind of ends up in another. Tell me about the kind of eccentric first part of Hitman where, he's establishing all these wacky identities.
Yeah, so there's 2 things happen musically in the beginning. One is the New Orleans music palette really gets established separately from the score, but it's this musical. Everyone knows of New Orleans as a musical city, and I touched on it a little bit by having trombones in and a few nods to the New Orleans element, but there was that, and then my remixes that I did on the black box, which listening out of context, there's all sorts of reverse things and delays, and there's a quirkiness to them that doesn't sound like obvious, maybe film music at first, but it goes with the quirkiness of what's happening on screen, and then later in the film, that particular palette fades away, both the New Orleans palette and not fully fade away, especially the New Orleans palette, but that remix palette, and then something more melodic and a little heavier and with string quartet, not big strings, but more string quartet starts to replace that as it gets more serious and more emotional.
Yeah. So again, if you're watching, send in your questions. Graham can kill someone for you and do it he's actually for real. One thing is that, the movie starts off pretty lighthearted, but then it starts getting serious. There become stakes in this movie. What's it like, when you have a movie that starts off as just a flat out comedy, then it starts turning into something else maybe?
Yeah, it's a delicate thing because you want a cohesive feel. Like there are great movies that I'm trying to think of an example, but that have, a dual character where halfway through it turns into a very different movie. But this one sort of gradually becomes something else, sort of the way the character gradually transforms. And before, especially Glenn's character, before he knows it, he's capable of doing things he didn't realize he was capable of. And so I think the music also needs to follow that arc where it can't be a sudden, oh, now we're serious. It has to be a gradual transition to where some much heavier things can happen and have the believability elements still intact.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think that Glenn's performance brings to this movie?
I mean, it's amazing. There's, it seems like an actor's dream where you get to play all these characters and just show off your chops. And, he's played the handsome guy in a lot of movies, and now he gets to be the guy with all the scars, or the guy he gets to transform himself into things that are quite unattractive, and then go back to like the hypersexualized guy with the sunglasses and not quite shaven look. And so it just seems like an actor's playground to me, and he really brings it.
And how did that inspire the scoring? I mean, when you just see him kind of do almost a Peter Sellers routine through this whole thing.
Well, it really opens it up. The playfulness, the sort of virtuosity meets playfulness that he brings to the screen allows the music to be equally playful, while making sure that the craft level is high as well.
But what's cool about this is that, this could have been totally done well, like Steven Soderbergh direct, where it's just this kind of really fun, glib movie and it just moves along. But this is very much a Richard Linklater movie, because suddenly this movie will stop for these kind of ambling conversations you'd never have in a genre movie like this.
Yeah, a rich sense of pacing, especially with dialogue, is so different from what anybody else does and so particular to him. He had that student feature that he did before Slacker, where there's almost no dialogue. And then Slacker has that you don't meet the characters again as you go through. But then by the time you get to Dazed and Confused, you get these very realistic feeling conversations, because they're so much deeper and allow ideas to be fleshed out in a way that they're not typically in a film cut to typical pacing.
Now, I've got a question from Ivan at the Bond Music. What kind of collaboration is more interesting for you, with the new director or the one with whom you've already worked previously? And what are the pros and cons in working with some director you found? Or with the same director you found?
Yeah, they both have, I'd say it's easier to work with someone you've worked with before. I mean, you develop a shorthand, you understand their aesthetic, and a little bit more. You just have a way of communicating that's easier, and you figure out how notes are most effective and what they mean by, or if they say, not sure. If not sure means, oh, you might be pretty close, or it means, no, don't ever play this for me again, or does it mean, what does that mean? So getting to know a person, of course, makes communication easier. But it's always fun to collaborate with new people, and I get the best of both worlds, where I have quite a few collaborators, both in film, but also in dance and theater and musicians that I've worked with over and over again. And we've all developed this way of communicating and making art together. But then I'm always working with new people as well. So finding that balance where you get with new people, it opens up the box in a way. The reason I enjoy collaboration at all is it pushes me to do things I wouldn't normally do, and pushes me to explore territory and ideas that I wouldn't normally. And so a new collaborator really opens that all up, because they're going to have a whole different set of aesthetic ideas and interests that will pull me in directions that I've never gone before.
Now, on that note, we've got a question from Aaron Cruz. Graham, how is your approach to scoring silent films, namely your live performances of F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu or Hitchcock's The Lodger, different from scoring modern projects with dialogue?
So years and years ago, I hadn't done any features, and Tim League and Carrie had just built the first Alamo Draft House. And Tim asked if I would be interested in scoring a silent film. And I said yes. And it was Battleship Potemkin, which is amazing and epically long. And there are two huge differences between a silent film and a new film. One, the director is dead. So there's no one to get notes from. There's no one to get feedback from. There's no back and forth in that way. which is harder because you can't talk to them about their intent, and then easier because I'm in charge of the final decisions. The other big thing is that, well, there's no other audio, so you have to have music the entire time. So when I came to scoring new features, it seemed so much easier than doing a silent film. Instead of 2 hours plus of straight music, it was a few minutes here, 30 seconds here, a little bit there, another longer cue here. It was a fraction of the amount of music. So it was like, running a marathon, and then, you've only got to run a mile. The mile's pretty easy at that point. I'm not saying that every film is easy. There are plenty of challenges, but as far as the weight of the amount of music that needs to be made, that's much lower, much easier than silent films.
I was lucky enough to go to Austin for Fantastic Fest when they had Phantasm Ravager there, and it's just such a truly awesome place with the world's best barbecue. But it's also a place where you're getting some really cool, like the Octopus Project, who did Sasquatch Sunset. Is there like a community of kind of like indie rock dudes turned composers there? Or do you interact with them, or?
Yeah, it's actually been growing. We've, as the city has gotten more and more popular, and it's gotten less and less affordable, and certain elements of the performing arts and art scene have shrunk, and certain elements have prospered. Theater has gone from being very, very active to being a shadow of itself because it's very difficult to make in an expensive city. But indie classical music, or I don't know what the right term for it is, but that has exploded. And there was just a 2-day festival. It's a great festival in its second year called Here Be Monsters. 20 little nonprofits or ensembles doing this kind of music played over the course of 2 days. Huge, like packed houses and 2 stages each day, and so there's a thriving scene now with all sorts of work being created.
Now, back to Hitman, I think one of my favorite scenes in the film was a total homage to Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he's going, "Kiss me here, does it hurt here?" And in a way, Glenn Powell's character is kind of like a superhero. Did you have that sense while scoring this?
Yeah, I mean, both he and Adria are larger than life. They're these 2 beautiful people with amazing chemistry doing something, and I think this is public, whereas the true story goes up to a certain point of the film, and then it evolves into an imaginary story. And so it goes from an already wild story, a story so wild it made a great article on this idea for a film because it seemed so unlikely, and then taking it to its extreme and imagining the story continuing in this way. So they become larger than life the way superheroes are, about a third to halfway through the film, and they keep getting bigger that way.
How did you want to score that? And again, it comes, I think, to the point of getting it serious. But again, you can't, even when you're playing it serious, you can't be too serious, with it.
Yeah, even in the darkest scenes in the movie, there's usually some bit of humor. So, it can't be too heavy. And it can't be so present that it's dragging down and doesn't allow for the scene to breathe or for the humor to work. So that's a balance point we worked on quite a bit. There are only a couple of scenes where the music stays pretty serious the whole time, and where it'd be harder for the comedy to work.
Yeah, and I really love I think it's a cello playing where he talks about the id. That's another really cool part of the score.
There's we have some great string players that I work with, and on this one, Invoke is a quartet here who can play Bartok, can play all the heavy hitter classical stuff, but also make their own music and do a sort of Americana bluegrass thing. They all play fretted instruments as well as their string instruments, and they're all improvisers. So it's amazing I'll toss a piano chart to them, and then we'll divide it up in the room and develop ideas that way. If I run out of time before they get there, I can just keep trying ideas and plugging in. So and they're amazing to work with, and give me this like super weapon to apply to cues.
So I guess there was a bunch of improvisation going on in this as well.
I grew up improvising and making up my own music live, and trained in jazz as well because of that. And so I try to work with players who can both read the charts and can improvise. And I like, somebody like Duke Ellington, who tries to fit the players into his aesthetic world, but also from the beginning of his career to the end was always bringing in players that could do things that he was not capable of. And so I could sit around and think all day of what cool stuff you should do on an upright bass, but someone who's an expert at it is going to have a broader palette there. So I try not to restrict my ideas to what's in my head. I try to make the full context and that other people can create within and play around within.
So tell me about the documentary God Save Texas that you've done with Richard.
Yeah, so that was 3-part doc series, and I was able to score 2 of them. And Rick's episode is centered around Huntsville and the prison there in East Texas. And I've spent a bunch of time, obviously, all around Texas, but in East Texas. And that one, like Bernie, had a jumping off point where, okay, we're like the Texas element of this is going to be overt. So there's pedal steel, there's acoustic guitar, there are things that like pedal steel doesn't, I don't think it's anywhere in Hitman. It doesn't have a place really in that, or not an obvious place at least. I love working with pedal steel. But we built a Texas palette, and then the idea with the theme, like the title sequence, was meant to be a layering of nods to each of the episodes. The other episode I scored was the border episode, so El Paso, Juarez. So trying to nod towards Mexican and Mexican-American music without pretending that I'm Mexican-American myself, but bringing in some amazing players, including Josh Baca, who's conjunto accordionist, who's extraordinary, and applying his palette and allowing him to play within the world that I've made.
What do you think about what's going on? I mean, obviously Texas is kind of like, on that musical term at least, Texas is kind of like a flashpoint, for the border crisis that's, going on politically right now, that everyone's playing for big stakes. But what do you think that this whole thing is kind of bringing to, using, Latin musicians? I mean, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Do you think it like puts a spotlight on musically these people, or?
That's a big question. So I'll try to answer it in a couple of ways. I think you hear popular music on both on the radio and on charts. You see more Spanish language hits crossing over into American pop charts and radio than you ever did before. So there's some melting of the border that way, which is exciting. In Texas, Texas, of course, used to be part of Mexico. And so that cultural presence is very real and very present all the time here. And the borders are strange human-created things. And you cross it, and of course, as soon as you cross into Mexico, you feel different. Like you feel like you're in a new country. But at the same time, this is an artificial line that people have made. And so it's very blurry culturally. Like you feel it a little bit less when you go from El Paso into Juarez. You cross the bridge, it's the same street, and the street just continues. And we've been doing a whole bunch of Texas and Mexico collaborations. I have a little nonprofit called Golden Hornet. We did a project called MXTX, where we had DJs and composers and electronic artists and producers make a sample library, and then make we commissioned a bunch of compositions combining a sort of mixed chamber rock jazz group with the sample libraries, and then DJ. And then we did concerts here and in Mexico. So we've been trying to do a lot of cultural exchange from Texas to Mexico, and acknowledge, and that's sort of our joining in the dialogue about the border.
Right on. Now we've got a question from Carl King. How do you address the problem of how much detail to add to your scores, which might be lost due to the final mix? Have you ever feel you lost something cool because of the final mix?
I mean, you lose things all the time when you make art, even if it's not in film. You have to let go. Like, there's the kill your babies is the extreme cliche there, where if you're not willing to edit things, it becomes very hard to make something great. And you have through the editing process, you're going to lose things that are good and that you love in order to make the whole stronger. And so, yes, I mean, especially in film, you have to let your ego be ready for all sorts of things to get thrown away. And some projects I own all the music, and so I can repurpose something that I really love and put it towards something else, or like transfer it to a different project. And then other times, if it's a big enough film, I might not own the music, in which case I don't get to repurpose it, and it goes into a folder and disappears forever. And you just have to be emotionally prepared for that. I think newer and younger composers in particular can have a really hard time with that. But I go in from the very beginning, almost assuming that most of it will be thrown away, and go from there.
I really like the locations that Richard's films have taken you to, and again, just the stylistic opportunities it gives you. And on that note, what was it like to go in at the tail end of the Before Sunrise trilogy?
That was heavy. You already have this great first two movies that didn't really have a problem that needed to be fixed. And so, I felt like I had to tread very carefully. It's by far the score of mine that's listened to the most, on Spotify or wherever. But at the same time, it's the most spare score maybe I've ever done for a feature. There are only 8 cues or something like that. I think there are 2 licensed tracks of Greek songs, but then other than that, it's 8 cues and with a very clear theme and sprinkled throughout. I could be wrong. It's not, that might not be the exact number, but whatever it is, there are huge chunks with no music, and then it comes in, and that spareness, I think, makes it pop in a way where you hear the theme, you recognize the theme and the palette, and when the music is there, it's very clear to the audience. So it's something that seems to have resonated.
And another really powerful movie that I wish more people had seen, which you brought, an orchestral touch to, is Last Flag Flying, which is essentially a sequel to The Last Detail.
Yeah, that was quite a project, an amazing cast. I felt like it was a film that could speak across political lines, which is very hard right now to make art that speaks across political lines. And not only speak to a wider audience like that, but about war and about military and about the American military in a way that would resonate. But for whatever reason, that it wasn't pushed really hard, and it sort of disappeared. But it's in there on Amazon Prime for anyone who wants to take a look. I think it's a strong film.
It's very good, and again, the whole kind of the alleged anthemic quality of the memorial of what this film is about.
Yeah, I think as you said, Hitman is the biggest thing Rick's had in a long, long, long time, and with it being the #1 film on Netflix, people around the world are watching a Richard Linklater movie. So I think there's a very good chance that some of his other films that may have gotten lost a bit, like Last Flag Flying, might get another look or two from both the Amazon in this case, who maybe they put it up a little higher in the search, or from people just looking for more from this artist.
You know, and on that note, one movie and score I really enjoyed is Where Did You Go, Bernadette? You know, Richard Linklater kind of woman's picture where she ends up in Antarctica. And again, just how do you play a story like that?
Yeah, that one. So it's, Kate Blanchett is awesome in there. It's this book that was very popular. And so that one, I had the book to read first, and then the script, and then the initial rough cuts. So we were able, again, to develop ideas early. And it's playful and light, and for much of it. And so the score gets to be playful at times. There's an action quality towards the end. I mean, they have that storm that looks totally fake, but was actually fully real, where the ship was getting tossed and they're shooting, and then they had to stop the shoot so everyone could go be sick. And so there are these things that look like you would never shoot in this weather, but they actually did. So it was a fun film to do, and another one that I'm hoping will get a little bit more attention now that Hitman is seeming to be so popular right now.
You know, I think a lot like essentially a lot of composers and musicians in Austin, you've got a lot going on. What would you like to know people to know that you've been up to, like ballet and spoken word and just a lot of cool stuff?
Yeah, I love collaborating new material. I like performing live and having that feed into what I do for film and TV work. Been spending a lot of time with Fire Records in London, who worked with Lakeshore years ago to release a Scanner Darkly score on vinyl, and we've developed a relationship. So we have a track called Linger in Silence with this Italian singer, Marta Del Grandi, and made an EP sort of based around that. That's the one that features that Omnisphere patch harmonic influences. It's a 4-song EP on the way to building an album. And it just, the whole thing starts with that patch and one little simple motif in my left hand. And then the rest of the album are sort of variations around that theme or layers put on top of that theme. Then I did an Edgar Allan Poe ballet this past year. That was a ton of fun for the symphony and ballet here. And we're working on album material for that. We have a bunch of ballet material up on Spotify and whatever platform you use. Collaboration is my favorite thing to do, and I've always been hard to market because I like to do so many different types of things. So don't expect the next album to sound like Hitman or the album after that to sound. I was in Sweden, and all I did was play a big, giant, huge orchestral bass drum for a week, and that was my whole job. I did this dance score for Deborah Hay, who used to be in the circle with Merce Cunningham, John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, and there was a new commission work over in Sweden. And so it was quiet experimental sounds, mostly made on the bass drum, plus a little manipulated vocal and a touch of pedal steel and piano. But it's just quiet, intimate bass drum playing.
Wow. Any cooking up anything with Richard that you can tell us about?
So, nothing right now that I can talk about at all, but, and, a lot of his films don't need score. He's not, just because Rick's doing a movie, it's not autopilot where he feels he needs a score. So I think he's also got some projects that are based around, or musicals that have been based around pre-existing musical work. So there are a couple films that I don't think will need score, and then we'll be doing some fun stuff after that, I think.
One thing I really love about Hitman is that the cues are really short. I mean, this is a whole bunch of fun little short cues, almost like a cartoon scoring in a way until you get to the longer stuff.
Yeah, it's I think that's that comedy thing where it allows for these, music comes in, goes out, does its job, but it's not underscoring a whole scene. The music's never telling you when to laugh or something like that. but it's keeping the momentum going. And then later on in the film, the second half of the movie is where the score takes more of its time doing its work. As the film becomes less comedic, the score slows its pace down.
Well, I guess to wrap up, again, congratulations on the success of this. I think probably it might be the biggest thing that Richard has had since School of Rock. What do you think about Hitman's success? People really digging this movie, and what part does the score have to play in that, do you think?
I think in this one, the score is, for most listener viewers, it's on the subtle side, where I think the New Orleans music that Randy put in is really strong and makes an overt statement. And then gradually the score takes over and it's more subtle. So I hope people listen. Netflix did put out the album, so that's out there to listen to. And I'd be curious to know what people thought of it out of context as well. There's quite a bit of music in there that I've done, but it doesn't jump out because that's not its job in this one.
No, it's just really a super fun movie. Graham, I want to thank you so much for joining us at Film Music Live. I want you all to watch Hitman on Netflix with Graham's score available on Netflix Music. And a big thanks to our show producer, Dale Turner, executive producer, Mark Northam, and graphic designer, Mark Banning. And I'll be seeing you on the next episode of Film Music Live next Monday, June 17th at noon, when we discover the primevals with composer Richard Band. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you.